Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. Before we jump in, thanks to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and of course, if you add comments to the videos, like, share, subscribe, all of that stuff, it is a immense benefit and a support to helping grow our audience for what we hope are important and impactful messages. Now, let's jump into the story. Putin wants everyone to think that he is a tough nut, uncrackable, in fact. And the Oreshnik missile system is an extension of his threat and bluster, one might even say symbolic of his authority and virility. But the Oreshnik appears to have been cracked by Ukraine. Let's explore this story. Oreshnik, the hazelnut, is one of the Kremlin's latest so-called wonder weapons, a hypersonic, nuclear-capable, intermediate-range ballistic missile that Vladimir Putin has hyped as unstoppable. But much to his annoyance, I presume, Ukraine says its security and intelligence services, the SBU, GUR, its foreign intelligence service, has located it, reached it, and destroyed it deep inside Russia, not on the front line or while it was being transported. This apparently happened at the Kapustin Yar missile range in Astrakhan Oblast, and they claim to have achieved this months ago, quietly, surreptitiously, then revealed it at a Kyiv briefing late last week. That's reported in the Kyiv Independent. It raises so many questions: how they did it, why the operational silence with regards to the achievement. And of course, Russia has chosen silence, but perhaps for more obvious reasons. According to the Moscow Times write-up of that briefing, SBU chief Vasil Malyuk put it starkly: one of the three Oreshnik systems was successfully destroyed on their territory at Kapustin Yar. That's the Moscow Times, October 31st. Now, timeline details differ slightly by outlet, but the claim is the same, that Ukraine penetrated deep inside Russia to a highly secure and secret location, and one Oreshnik is now gone. One of the Kremlin's premier terror signaling tools has been literally cracked, and the story fits a pattern we've seen for a few years now. Moscow threatens wonder weapons, game-changing munitions and capabilities, military miracles, and Kyiv methodically degrades the myth and destroys the weapon, collapsing Russia's terror narratives. Well, that was taken from Reuters. Tough nut, how Ukraine says it obliterated Oreshnik. Let's lay out the details of what and where. At the Kyiv press conference on October 31st, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Oreshnik was hit inside Russia in a covert operation involving SBU, HUR, GUR, and other branches of the intelligence services. The site, the Kapustin Yar test range, Russia's long-time strategic missile playground. That's from Kyiv Independent. The Moscow Times adds further texture. Ukraine's services collaborated and executed a 100% successful operation at the range. It also captures the official ambiguity that matters strategically here. Kiev is deliberately fogging how and when it happened, maximizing the deterrence value, and of course, aiming to increase anxiety in the Kremlin. Why is Kapustin Yar important? Because this isn't just sabotaging a launcher on a rail siding or at some random base. This is reaching into the inner sanctum of Russia's defense industry. A site that has a mystique that goes back to the Soviet Union and indeed the early era of Russian nuclear capability, and where Russia breeds its prestige systems. Such places are meant to be untouchable. If Kiev can penetrate and hit a crown jewel test site like this, then the myth of sanctuary for Russia's strategic military toys is over. Oreshnik was a story of reality versus hype from the very start. Reuters described the Oreshnik's first combat use in November 2024. The missile carried multiple warheads, but no explosives. That's from Reuters, November 26, 2024, and the military impact was certainly underwhelming, more political theatre than battlefield revolution, now shown to be vulnerable to targeting on the ground. So what is Oreshnik? What are the specs, the claims, and the small print? The Kremlin's sales pitch has been consistent. Oreshnik is a hypersonic, impossible to intercept, and capable of striking across Europe. In November 2024, Putin called it a new system that existing air defenses cannot intercept. That's from Medusa, November 21st, 2024. Short note, there are currently no air defense systems capable of intercepting the Oreshnik missile. Well, that is the Russian claim. What we can infer from multi-source reporting is that its categorization is an intermediate range ballistic missile, an IRBM, not an ICBM, though the boundary is politically useful for Moscow's messaging. What is its design lineage? Multiple analysts think it's a reworking or a derivative of an RS-26 Rubège, a shelved program reskinned into something new. Medusa Explainer, November 22nd, 2024. Quick note, it is likely a modification of the RS-26 Rubège missile, and it has a claimed range of 5,000 kilometers with a 700-kilometer dead zone, the minimum arc where it's not practical to use it. Zelensky repeated that figure on October 31st at the press briefing. That is Kyiv Independent, citing original reporting from Suspilne. The speed. Ukrainian and Reuters report on the November 21st, 2024, that the strike referenced Mach 11, that is 13,600 kilometers per hour peak velocity. Short quote, it reached a top speed of 13,600 kilometers per hour, and the warhead concept, the demo shot at Dnipro, appears to have used multiple inert, non-explosive re-entry vehicles to create an awe effect without mass casualties. Something like a giant firework, in fact, signaling rather than achieving real destruction. Well, that's from Reuters reporting at the time, 26th to the 28th of November 2024. So the Kremlin's hazelnut is a repurposed platform, most likely with a big mouth politically, but without the apparent power to back up its threats. It can theoretically haul nuclear payloads, but if Russia were to deploy those munitions, it would be a game changer, likely drawing Europe far deeper into the conflict on Ukraine's side and possibly alienating China and other allies of Russia. In practice, Oreshnik has been used as a messaging vehicle designed to frighten and instill fear, all bark and very little bite, which is exactly why destroying one inside Russia at a top secret base is both an operational hit and an incredible exercise in myth puncturing by Ukraine. So how many of these does Russia actually have, and where might they go? On October 31st, 2025, Zelensky said that Russia currently has 6 Oreshnik missiles left, with plans to deploy launch complexes in Belarus. That tracks with earlier Belarusian posturing Zapad 2025 exercises and parade room models that were seen in Lukashenko's office. That is from Ukrainska Pravda and RBC Ukraine. A short quote here from RBC. The Russians still have the capacity to launch up to 6 Oreshnik missiles. Ukrainska Pravda reminds us that Russia has fired only once in combat so far, and Minsk has repeatedly teased Belarusian basing for this class of munition. Zelensky also said Kyiv has handed partners a list of 25 Russian companies linked to Oreshnik's production that remain unsanctioned, and calling for pressure on them. United 24's write-up captures that sanctions push. 6 shots, of course, do not amount to a stockpile and is not even strategic in classical military terms. It's a finite prestige batch of terror weapons, useful for rattling the saber in the faces of foreign adversaries, but not for sustained battlefield effect. That scarcity explains why Oreshnik is all talk and very little action. Let's put Oreshnik in context of Russia's wonder weapons pattern. Let's zoom right out. Since 2018, the regime's propaganda arc There's been a string of invincible weapons announced one after the other. Kinjal, Zircon, Avant-Garde, Poseidon, and Oreshnik. Each debut is met with grandiose claims. Each meets physics and reality, judges them to be less than threatening or less than they're made out in the press releases. Kinjal was touted as unbeatable, then Patriot batteries in Kyiv proved that it can be intercepted. Here's a short quote from Reuters, May 26, 2023. Ukraine shot down a Russian hypersonic missile for the first time. Follow-up reports have just echoed that pattern. One of those was that 6 Kinjals were intercepted in a single night. That is from May 16th, 17th, 2023. And of course, many more have been shot down since then. The Zircon, the naval hypersonic, has struggled for reliable battlefield impact and availability. Avant-Garde remains primarily a strategic deterrent talking point. The cross-analysis on that from open sources, MOD briefings, and are consistent with Medusa and Reuters Oreshnik assessments. All bark, no bite. Oreshnik fits that same script. It debuts with extravagant theatrics, multi-warheads, big speed claims, and invincibility threatened. Drip-feed propaganda about Inception being impossible. Then we get the cracks in the story. Ukrainian sabotage on the ground. Western experts call into question its origins and capabilities, and open sources indicate that mass production isn't even yet a reality, a possibility for Russia. That's from Reuters, Medusa, KI, and RBC. So what are some of these strategic implications? Belarus, INF's Ghost, and Europe's air defense map. If Oreshnik launchers are positioned in Belarus, does the geometry of intimidation change? A 5,000-kilometer class missile stationed near Minsk puts most of Europe inside its envelope. But does it change the war? Well, given the number of units available, 5 now, it absolutely does not. And beneath these theatrics, arms control is already broken. Post-INF treaty, both sides maneuver within the 500 to 5,500 kilometer space. Russia openly signaled it would not honor past self-imposed limits. See AP and Reuters coverage of that from 24 to 25. Oreshnik's shadowy debut is part of the post-INF signaling contest. Number 2, air and missile defense is catching up. The Patriot versus Kinjal episode shows that hypersonic does not equal invincible. Systems designed for ballistic track interception can adapt. Investments in layered defense, Patriot, SAMP-T, IRIS-T, NASAMS, and soon TLVS class capabilities keep shifting the cost and capability calculus. Again, Reuters reporting. And finally, 3, scarcity and visibility. With very few units of these apparently available, any Oreshnik launch is high cost and potentially low impact when tracked against the expenditure of production and launch. The more Russia relies on expensive message shots, the less resource it has to impact the fight on the ground. Especially when Kyiv can credibly claim it has already cracked 1 missile inside Russia and shown its basing to be highly vulnerable. That's Moscow Times and Kyiv Independent. Well, let's have a look at what to watch out for over the next 2 to 4 weeks. Sanctions drive against the Oreshnik ecosystem. Zelensky's claim that 25 Russian firms tied to the program are not yet sanctioned. Do the G7 and EU move on that list? Will they show any urgency? United 24 and Kyiv Independent are tracking updates on that story. Then there are the Belarus basing signals. Watch Lukashenko's theatrics. The models on his desk, will they turn from just models to hardware in the field? And the Belarus MOD NOTAM's ground movement, that's their own air defense and tracking systems. Ukrainska Pravda has been parsing this story and following it closely. Then there are Russian informational operations. Expect renewed claims that Oreshnik is impossible to intercept and nuclear equivalent in its conventional launch mode, alongside threats to hit decision-making centers, both in Ukraine and in Europe. US and allied intel floated that Russia might fire another Oreshnik after the 2024 trial. Well, we're getting to the end of 2025 and we have not seen that yet. If Moscow wants to reclaim narrative momentum, another message launch is the obvious play. Well, that was speculation from Medusa in December 2024. We're a year on and it still hasn't happened. Oreshnik shows the preference of belligerent autocracies on threat messaging rather than reality. We can only hope that this is their downfall, the self-consuming addiction to the lies that they generate, and the conformity that such regimes demand. Oreshnik is a case in point, expensive to make, scarce to field, deployed to frighten, but disappointing if ever used in action. Such munitions create external terror threat messaging, but also may signal internally within a regime. It may highlight weaknesses, systemic weaknesses within Russia's military sector, overstating capabilities to please the Tsar, hiding weaknesses and vulnerabilities because to admit these to the bosses or to the Tsar would be career ending. Oreshnik may well be the product not only of a malignant regime, but also one that feeds on its own myths and lies. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.